On November 9th, 2021, police raided a lakefront mansion in Gainesville, Georgia. They quickly found about $700,000 in cash, but that was chump change. The real jackpot was in the bathroom. Inside a closet, police found an old popcorn tin. And inside the tin, they found $3.4 billion, all of it stolen. The man responsible was Jimmy Zhong, a smart, awkward guy who stole a fortune, got away with it, and then lost everything because of one stupid mistake. Jimmy was born in 1990. He grew up in Cobb County, Georgia, and had an unfortunate childhood to say the least. His parents had immigrated from China and were struggling to make their lives in America work. His mother found employment as a nurse working the night shift at a local hospital. His father was, at best, semi-employed. He liked to buy and resell used items at flea markets and the like. In general, Jimmy's home life was lacking. His mother was constantly exhausted while his father was lethargic and remote. Eventually, his parents drifted apart and divorced. But compared to his life at school, home must have been an oasis. Jimmy was bullied mercilessly for being Chinese, overweight, and on the autism spectrum. On one occasion, bullies pulled his pants down at a school football game in front of everyone. To say Jimmy's life was less than ideal would be putting the case mildly. Like many lonely, awkward young people, however, he soon found an escape. Predictably, that escape was the internet. Rejected by his classmates and ignored by his family, Jimmy spent hours alone in his room on his computer. That time was not wasted, however, as we'll soon see. Jimmy learned all kinds of coding languages. He was kind of a computer whiz. Despite the fact his parents had no time for him and his classmates wrote him off, Jimmy was really smart. Coming out of high school, he won a prestigious scholarship to study computer science at the University of Georgia. In 2008, he moved to Athens, Georgia to do just that, leaving his old life behind. As a matter of fact, he never spoke to his parents again. While Jimmy must have been elated to graduate from his miserable high school existence, his life would take a darker turn now that he was 18 years old and out on his own. Early in 2009, Jimmy was browsing the web when he stumbled on a paper that would set him on the path to riches and ruin. It was called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, written by the mysterious and probably non-existent Satoshi Nakamoto. This essay was the beginning of cryptocurrency. Here's where we need to give a brief explanation of how crypto works. Our understanding is sometime in the mid-2000s, a leprechaun hid a bunch of golden coins in the internet, and if you shake your iPad just right, you can retrieve them. Is that right? Did we nail it? If that's not right and you actually know how crypto works, please leave a comment and educate us. We are in desperate need. Anyway, all we really need to understand Jimmy's story is this. Jimmy was what people in the crypto world call an OG, original gangster. He was one of the earliest Bitcoin guys, and he set up a program to mine it on his laptop. But that's not how Jimmy made $3.4 billion. In 2009, Bitcoin was completely worthless. It wasn't until 2011 that it caught on, and those coins he'd mined 2 years ago were suddenly worth something. Now Jimmy got into Bitcoin in a big way, mining, participating in forums, and also running his own crypto gambling site. He was in his third year of college, and for the first time in his life, he had some money to blow. And he blew it. On blow. Also booze and gambling. Jimmy became a bit of a party animal, drinking until he blacked out, using cocaine and other drugs, and generally numbing the pain of his sad childhood and social awkwardness. As a matter of fact, illegal drugs were the other key component that would make Jimmy a billionaire. New, nefarious opportunities were opening up as the criminal world went digital. Around this time, Jimmy discovered Silk Road. Silk Road was a dark web, anything-goes marketplace that used Bitcoin as its sole currency. Basically, Silk Road allowed anyone to order anything from anywhere in the world, with virtual anonymity. People bought and sold all kinds of stuff on Silk Road, ranging from completely legal products and services to forged licenses to drugs. But about 70% of it was drugs. And to be clear, Jimmy was there for the drugs. But he apparently didn't like the service because after just a few orders, he decided to withdraw the Bitcoin from his Silk Road account. That's when he made his big discovery. When he withdrew his coins, Jimmy accidentally double-clicked. Much to his surprise, he found that Silk Road gave him twice the Bitcoin he'd tried to take out. This error meant that Jimmy could withdraw many times more coins than he'd ever deposited. So he did. In one day, he turned 500 coins into 3,000, which was worth about $30,000 at that time. But why stop there? Jimmy did some research and discovered exactly how many coins Silk Road had for him to steal. See, despite the fact that the owners of Bitcoin accounts or purses are anonymous, all transactions are public. Jimmy figured out which purse funded Silk Road's withdrawals, waited until it was full, and then used his clicky attack to steal about $620,000 worth of coins in one day. Unsurprisingly, the guy who ran Silk Road, Ross Ulbricht, aka Dread Pirate Roberts, noticed this. But he didn't do anything about it. He simply asked how the deed had been done. Then he thanked Jimmy for telling him and gave him more Bitcoin as a bonus. At 22 years old, Jimmy had just taken a bunch of drug dealers for a $500,000 ride and gotten away with it. Given his issues with gambling, alcohol, and drugs, you might assume he would party all that money away. In fact, he didn't. He sold his legal Bitcoin to buy a small house and a used Mercedes-Benz, something he'd always wanted. He created multiple accounts on crypto forums and made ridiculous posts bragging about his wealth, claiming to manage a huge investment fund. Sometimes he even engaged in weird conversations with himself through his various online avatars. He kept drinking and he kept doing drugs, but he put the 50,000 coins he'd stolen into 2 purses and didn't touch them. However, the FBI was about to make the first move that would ultimately lead to Jimmy's downfall. In 2013, the feds shut down Silk Road and arrested Dread Pirate Roberts. In so doing, they acquired Silk Road's database, which naturally contained all the evidence of Jimmy's scam. The government seized hundreds of thousands of coins from Roberts, but they knew many were still missing, and they wanted all of them. This could potentially be very bad news for Jim, but more on that later. In 2014, Jimmy graduated from college. The price of Bitcoin was on the rise, and his secret stash was now worth about $30 million. He also had plenty of legitimate Bitcoin to sell. With his future set, Jimmy went about buying the things he'd never really had. And we're not talking about the house and the car. We're talking about social acceptance and positive attention. Now Jimmy could afford to buy affection, and he did. He took all his friends on 5-star vacations, to sporting events, to concerts and clubs, and he always footed the bill. He even gave out Bitcoin as gifts. Jimmy did get himself arrested for DUI, and he caught a possession charge when an off-duty cop saw him openly doing a bump of cocaine in a restaurant. But apart from that, he'd proven surprisingly cautious. That would all end in 2017, when Jimmy's online grandstanding would attract more scrutiny than he could withstand. In March of that year, Jimmy got into a spat with another big-time crypto investor on an internet forum. Basically, Jimmy challenged the guy to do a deal that would have been worth about $60 million. This got people's attention and inspired at least one netizen to do a little digging. Jimmy had posted the links to his Bitcoin purses in order to prove to other posters that he really was rich. With that information, someone was able to trace his transactions and discover that the original source of his coins was Silk Road. When this came out, Jimmy left his crypto forum never to return. However, despite the collapse of Silk Road and despite nearly outing himself with his bragging, Jimmy was riding high. By the end of 2017, 1 Bitcoin was worth almost $20,000 US, and Jimmy had over 50,000 of them. He was 28 years old, he'd only actually worked for about 2 months in his entire life, and he was now a billionaire. This was when he started spending in earnest. Jimmy shelled out for sports cars, boats, chartered jets, and started handing out USBs that contained about $1 million worth of Bitcoin apiece. He really wanted people to like him. Most bizarrely, though, he invested in a new briefcase, which he filled with $700,000 in cash. He later remarked that he did this because he'd seen it in movies and thought it would impress women and make them want to sleep with him. More on that later. As a matter of fact, it was the briefcase full of cash, not the hard drive full of Bitcoin, that was the true beginning of the end for Jimmy. In March of 2019, Jimmy came home to find his back window busted. Someone had broken in and stolen his briefcase full of cash. And most devastating, the culprit was definitely someone Jimmy considered a friend. Probably someone who had already received hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars worth of gifts from him. Instead of saying, oh, well, what's a couple $100,000 to a guy like me, Jimmy very foolishly called the police and reported the briefcase and the cash stolen. Now, remember, Jimmy had been smart with his loot. All the money he spent came from selling legitimate Bitcoin he had mined legally. But the thing is, when you tell the police you're an unemployed person who's been rocking around with $700,000 in a briefcase, they tend to get suspicious. All of this piqued the interest of an IRS cybercrime investigator. He began looking into Jimmy's finances just to make sure he was on the straight and narrow. From this point on, all Jimmy's legitimate crypto transactions would be monitored, but the IRS had no idea about the illegitimate ones. Yet. Shortly after the break-in, Jimmy moved out of his modest bungalow into a $1 million lakefront mansion. No doubt that made him look even more suspicious. Just as Jimmy had discovered the Silk Road loophole by accident, he was about to lose it all by accident. In November of 2020, Jimmy was moving some Bitcoin around, likely preparing it for sale so he could pump cash into a real estate investment. While doing this, he accidentally combined some of his legitimate coin with his stolen coin. Something he had been very careful not to do. The IRS investigator had been tracking Jimmy's Bitcoin transactions. When he merged his legal purse with his illegal purse, the IRS could now see everything and track every move Jimmy had ever made, all the way back to Silk Road. The IRS had discovered that Jimmy Zhong was sitting on a pile of gold that came from Silk Road, that should have been confiscated way back in 2013. That brings us back to the beginning, to November 9th, 2021, when police raided Jimmy's house and found the Cheetos popcorn tin containing the hard drive that itself contained over $3.4 billion of stolen Bitcoin. Jimmy was arrested. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, did he actually do anything illegal? After all, the victim, Dread Pirate Roberts, had allowed him to keep the Bitcoin he stole, thanked him for stealing it, and even gave him more. For what it's worth, Jimmy thought he'd done something wrong. He told the judge he always knew that he was in the wrong, but having that money made him feel like he was somebody, like he mattered. From a legal perspective, Jimmy had committed fraud, aside from which the government had a right to seize any and all assets that ever passed through Silk Road. They wanted Jimmy's money, and they were never going to let that go. Although Jimmy was only sentenced to 1 year in prison, he lost everything and has reportedly been working as a Lyft driver since his release. The saddest part of all this is that Jimmy was abandoned by the so-called friends who hung around him when he was rich. He apparently does have a few true companions who liked him before he had money, but his attempts to buy affection ultimately came to nothing. We mentioned how Jimmy hoped his briefcase full of cash would convince women to sleep with him. Well, it didn't. These young ladies he's always pictured with, they weren't his girlfriends. According to Jimmy, he only ever had sex once, and he paid for it. In the end, Jimmy never really got to spend any of the Bitcoin that he stole, and his crime gave the government cause to seize all of the money he had made legally. Maybe crime sometimes does pay, but in the end, it always costs. If you enjoyed this video, give us a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to History Snob for more content. Thanks for watching.